We are looking now at spatial organizing principles of entity systems. The first one is that entity systems form a containing hierarchy. For example, this is the hierarchy that evolved in nature. The planet contains human societies, animal societies, plant societies, etc. A society contains individuals, an individual contains or consists of cells, cells contain molecules, molecules atoms, atoms particles, and so on. The concept of the containing hierarchy means that a system contains subsystems and that every system in turn is contained by a larger system. So I as an individual contain cells, but I am contained within society and the planet. We need to look at the difference between a containing and a control hierarchy. They are not the same. Typically, when we hear the word hierarchy, people think control hierarchy, that there is somebody on top, a president or a CEO, who tells everybody else what to do. This is typically the industrial age organizational form where top management made decisions and told everybody else what to do. This is not so in the containing hierarchy of life. In nature's containing hierarchy, the control flows inside out, outside in, and from self to self. Let me give you a simple example. If we have a rule in society, then I as an individual have to abide by it. For example, in this recording studio, it is not allowed to eat. So the control comes from outside my environment. If suddenly I get hungry and I get up to eat, where does the control come from? My cellular environment. The control flows inside out, from the cell to the individual. If I'm on a diet and I'm hungry and I say, well, I'm really hungry, I would like to eat that piece of chocolate cake, but I am strong, I will resist, then the control comes from me to me, from self to self. So in other words, control or governance in a containing hierarchy flows through all levels, up, down, in, out, self to self. Entity systems mark levels in the system's hierarchy. So there's the planetary level, the societal level, the individual level, the cellular level, etc. We can also look at levels between levels and also levels within levels. Let us first look at a level between levels. For example, between society and the individual, the psychosociosphere has evolved a considerable number of levels. For example, society consists of institutions such as labor institutions, education institutions, health institutions, and so on. An institution has different organizations, so the education institution would have schools, universities, kindergartens, etc. In an organization, there would be groupings, teams, pairs, and then the individual. Now, if you're looking at levels within the organization, then we could look at something like we have different departments and business units in an organization. There are different teams within each department, and then, of course, there are the different individuals. The levels in the systems hierarchy of nature are fixed. They have evolved like that. The levels in the sociosphere are not fixed. It's up to us how many levels, for example, we would have in an organization. And we know very well that flat organizations have much less levels than some of those industrial age traditional hierarchies, which had 100 levels sometimes. We are looking now at spatial organizing principles of entity systems. Entity systems have a threefold organization. They consist of bundles of outward-directed activity systems, inward-directed activity systems and self-directed activity systems. The directedness is in terms of purpose, not necessarily the flow of the substance within those activity systems. For example, the breathing activity system is one of a person's most important inward-directed activity systems because the purpose is directed at the inner cellular environment to provide it with oxygen. In terms of flow of air and gases, they flow in and out of the system. To give an example of what these bundles of activity systems could be, if the picture represents me as a person, I have various outward-directed activity systems like my family life, my work life, my life within society. I have bundles of inward-directed activity systems like nutrition, exercise, healthcare, maintenance, stress management, etc. And I have self-directed activity systems. I plan, I think, I do self-development activities, I'm playing, I'm doing things to please myself. Those are all self-directed activity systems. The activity systems connect the entity with systems in the outer environment and the inner environment, and obviously with itself. So different activity systems connect the entity system with other entity systems. For example, in my outward-directed family life, that activity system connects me to different entities in the family, while my work-life activity system connects me with other entity systems. The ethos in an entity system organizes the activity systems and their interaction. So the ethos is that information field that we have been talking about earlier, the morphogenetic field, according to which every activity system unfolds and which also governs the interaction between the different activity systems in the entity. And the entity system itself emerges from the interaction of its activity systems. There's the famous saying of system thinking that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The same is true in the context of an entity system. The entity is greater than the sum of its activity systems. I, Elizabeth, am more than the sum of my outward-directed functions, inward-directed and self-directed functions. My sense of self spans all those activity systems, and I have specific self-directed activity systems that allow me to reflect as a field of self against myself. So the entity system is an emergent property from the interaction of the various activity systems. An important principle of entity systems is that there should be a balance between outward, inward, and self-directed activity systems. For example, if I am spending too much time at work and I'm neglecting my inward-directed nutrition, rest, exercise, etc., I will burn out. There is a disease of imbalance. If I neglect my outward-directed activity systems and spend all my time with self-pleasing, self-directed activity systems, I'm a very selfish individual. If I'm only concerned with my inward-directed, I become very inward-focused, and in the worst example, I could be unconscious, maybe hooked up in a hospital to all these life support machines, and if I'm unconscious, there are no self-directed and outward-directed activity systems. I'm not really a whole human being at that time. There are also complete versus incomplete entity systems. Complete entity system is one that has all three types of activity systems, the outward, inward, and self-directed, in a relative balanced manner. By comparison, there are incomplete entity systems, like, for example, artifacts, all these products we have, cars, computers, houses, etc. They have a function directed at the outer environment, at us who are using it, but they do not have inward and self-directed activity systems. Even if some artifacts, automats, for example, have functions that are directed at maintaining themselves, they do their own maintenance, and they have some rudimentary self-directed activity systems that allow them to maybe gauge if it's necessary already to do the maintenance or not. They are not really fully blown entity systems, but they are on the way towards becoming entity systems. So technological evolution moves artifacts in the direction of building inward and self-directed activity systems into them. And the biotechnologies, genetic engineering, stem cell research, etc., has more of those activity systems embedded in the technology. We are looking now at spatial organizing principles of entity systems. Entity systems interact. They interact through their activity systems. They contribute to each other through their activity systems. And one of the principles is that these contributions need to be tapped. So you as an entity system who listen to discourse on biometric system theory, you need to tap what I'm saying in order for you to allow to become a system thinker as an entity. One important principle that we can deduce from the interaction is that exchange should be balanced. The exchange between entity systems should involve a give and take. If it does not, if some entity systems only take the contributions and never give, we will have imbalanced systems. There are some takers who exploit the givers, and we would have problems in the biometrics if there is not an overall balance between those systems. Now we can look at a balance of entity system across levels, or the interaction across levels in the biometrics. We are looking at linking across levels in terms of distributive and contributive activity systems. So if the gray shape and the gray areas represent, for example, me as a person, I have activity systems like nutrition and breathing that distribute the air and the nutrients to my cells. I have functions like the circulatory function that distributes equally to all cells, nutrients, for example. And the cells contribute to the organism. Or if we look at the example of society and individuals, society distributes to its individuals, for example, education, healthcare opportunities, transport systems. So very specific distributive functions. And what is important is that these functions are governed by equality. All members of society should have equal access to the opportunities offered by society. Equal access is not the same like equal distribution. To give everybody the same is not the same like allowing the same opportunities to access. For example, if we provide health care to individuals as a society, we allow each individual in society to access our services as they need in an equal manner. We are not providing every individual with exactly the same services, like giving them a heart transplant when they're 50. Likewise, our distributing system, the circulatory system in the body, offers to each individual cell equally all nutrients. So each cell has the opportunity to take out exactly those nutrients it needs in order to make a contribution to the organism. Those contributive activity systems are governed by freedom of expression, freedom of function, for example, freedom to choose the work that we want to contribute to society, just as the different cells in the body have the freedom to contribute according to their function. Let us look as an example at the two ideologies of the industrial age that governed the last 100 years, socialism versus capitalism, and how they differ from each other in terms of the biometrics principles. The communist socialist societies emphasized distribution of wealth, and they limited contribution. They limited the freedom of individuals to contribute according to their particular preferences. They also nationalized the economy, so governed it from a societal level, again a curtailing of freedom, they curtailed freedom of expression, etc. The result was that relatively little wealth was produced through contribution, and eventually there was nothing to distribute. By comparison, the capitalist countries emphasize contribution, freedom of expression, freedom of contribution, and as a result, more wealth is created. Where capitalist societies often fail is that they do not distribute equally to all members in society. If we are taking South Africa as an example, distribution was racially decided, so it advantaged some members of society and disadvantaged other members of society. So to have a balanced interrelationship between society and its individuals, we need freedom of contribution and equality of distribution in a balanced way. In a way, justice between the two contributive and distributive processes implies a balance. In some situations, it may be necessary to wait with distribution and first emphasize contribution so that the wealth is being created that can be distributed, while in other situations it may be more just to distribute due to the according contributions. So it is a matter of balance between contribution and distribution. We are looking now at spatial organizing principles of entity systems. Another principle is that of co-production. We can express it a bit differently. As entity systems emerge in the middle from co-production of systems in the outer environment and systems in the inner environment. So for example, if this is my system of focus, a person, maybe a child, the development of a child or the child emerges in the middle from the contributions of the outer environment, the parents, the schooling, peers, society, and the contributions from the inner environment of the child, their health, their constitution, their talents, etc. And then the child, him or herself, has to tap the outer and inner contributions in order to be able to develop. So the entity system emerges in the middle from the contributions of the outer and inner environment and the tapping thereof. A child that doesn't tap its talents, for example, isn't motivated to develop it, will have a different path of development than a child who does tap its inner contributions. Likewise, a child that does not grow up in a maybe environment that supports its talent cannot tap those opportunities and will develop differently. So essentially, entity systems emerge in the middle from the contribution of three levels: outer, inner, and self. But because of the tapping, ultimately all development is self-development. Another spatial organizing principle associated with entity systems is that entity systems are a matrix. More specifically, the activity systems within the entity system interact in a matrix way. For example, the circulation activity system in the body interfaces with all cells of all other functions, providing them with nutrients, taking away waste products, etc. So it is a matrix interaction between that system and all the other systems. So if we look at the matrix, our outward directed activity systems interface with inward directed activity systems. Some of the self-directed activity systems interact with all the other systems. And then we would have self-directed activity systems that link the different activity systems to the self of the organization, represented by the orange dot in the corner. Those are typically the self-referring, planning, decision-making, coordinating activity systems. We believe that the three-dimensional matrix is the generic organizational structure for an information age organization. And our whole organization transformation program is designed to assist an organization to transform into a 3D matrix, which is the most optimal way of interfacing all functions in an organization. It also allows learning, planning, decision-making to occur in the most optimal manner. Another principle is that entity systems are webs within webs. Now, the management gurus say that the information age organization hasn't emerged yet to the same extent as the traditional hierarchy was typical for the industrial age. But whatever emerges, it has to be a networked organization, an organization that interacts in multifaceted ways with the economy. Now, we believe that the 3D matrix allows that, because every single activity system has its own connectivities, very function-specific connectivities with the environment, and it also has connectivities for the organization as a whole. Now, for example, if we are looking at one of the production lines in an organization, for example, if you're looking at a bread baking factory, the black line would represent one of the types of breads, and it has its own suppliers of specialized supplies and also customers that want that specific type of bread, which is completely different to maybe the cakes that are being produced or other types of bread that are produced by some of the other lines. Likewise, one of the phases in cake baking, as we have said, is the baking phase. So if you're baking thousands of breads and cakes every day, this is one of the line functions in an organization. And it allows the organization to bring in anything that's new about baking technologies, etc., to bring into the organization through that particular activity system. Or if we look at one of the organization support systems or central service systems, as they're sometimes called in organizations, for example, one of those orange lines, that could be the IT system. If we have development in IT that are out there, that are new, then these developments are brought into the organization through that specific line and can help develop the organization as a whole. Could, for example, change the whole marketing strategy, or maybe it changes the production etc. So the 3D matrix allows interfacing within the web of the economy in a very multifunctional manner. We're looking now at organizing principles associated with systems boundaries. We have said previously that we can look at the biomatrix from a web perspective or from a field perspective. And these different perspectives impact on the way we are viewing boundaries. So let us first look at boundaries from a web perspective. We have a system of focus here that interacts with an external system. So for example, if the system of focus is our e-learning organization and the external system in our environment is you, the viewer, you accessed our web page. We had to access your application for viewing this particular course. We deliver the course to you and you have to access it, you have to view it, you have to listen. Where are the boundaries between you and us? Well, the boundaries are where we tap each other. So you reached as far as our web page where we tapped you, and we reach now as far as your retina and eardrum where you tap our teaching. Likewise, if we're looking at systems in the internal environment, the boundaries will again be in the tapping. For example, if I am the learner, in the system of focus is the learner, then the learning is being tapped by my inner environment, by my neural networks. If it's not tapped there, no learning takes place. My inner environment also brings up thoughts. I have thoughts about what I learn, and these thoughts need to be tapped by me as a person. I could also suppress those thoughts. So where's the boundary? Again, the boundary to the internal environment is where tapping takes place. So that is at the cellular level. I reach as far as the cellular level, and the cellular level reaches as far as where I, Elizabeth, am as a person. What is the significance of those boundaries? Well, first of all, if we talk from a web perspective, there are very clear boundaries between systems, and they are there where tapping takes place. And we need to remember what we learned about tapping, that there is a shift in responsibility in tapping. For example, I have to make it as easy for you as possible to understand biometric system theory, but you will have to make the effort to listen, and you need the motivation to want to learn. So there's a shift in responsibility. But also we have learned that tapping can be mediated. In other words, we need to be aware of our boundaries, and we need to manage the continuity of what we offer across boundaries. If we're looking at how I'm looking, or how an entity system is perceived by biometrics system theory, that is represented by that orange shape. We are not, as an entity system, a blob in a skin floating in the universe, isolated from another blob floating in the universe, but we are connected through our activity systems, and we are looking more like an octopus or a porcupine, reaching outward and inward to other systems. So biometric system theory perceives us in a connected way, and this is symbolized by the orange shape rather than by a round circle, as very often system thinkers represent a system. Now let us look at systems boundaries from a field perspective. We have learned that behind the web, or underlying the web of the biometrics, is an information field that contains a force that informs the unfolding of the web, and that we call that field the ethos field. So we have a system of focus and that ethos field associated with that system of focus. For example, me as a person. And my ethos is influenced and intermingles with an ethos of external systems. My family, my work life, my church life, my societal life, etc. So these kind of ethoses have shaped my ethos. Likewise, the ethos of my inner environment is shaping my ethos. And the boundaries between those ethoses are vague, they're fuzzy, we can see they're sort of fading in, and these different fields intermingle and shape each other. And when we manage information fields, we talk normally alignment. I need to align with my outer environment, with my inner environment. But where the one field starts and the other field ends is very difficult to say. And we experience that regularly in situations of interaction, very often psychological situations, where it's very fuzzy. Whose emotion changed first and took along the emotion of the other person, or whose ideas were first and who changed their thinking first. So there are boundaries that are very fuzzy, and we need to manage alignment. Let us give a summary of the spatial organizing principles. First of all, the spatial organizing principles of activity systems. We said that activity systems contain sub-activity systems. Those are chains of activity systems. They can be parallel or sequential sub-activity systems. We can also say that every activity system itself is part of a chain of activity systems within a larger super activity system. And this is typically what we study in supply chains or value chains. Then we looked at supply chains across the systems hierarchy, vertical supply chains, and along a level. The horizontal supply chain, an example of the vertical is the nutrition chain, an example of the horizontal would be an industry supply chain. And then we talked about continuity of matter, energy, information along the activity system chain in such a way that the output of one activity system becomes the input to the next activity system, where it is being processed into a new output which is tapped as an input by the next. So the continuity of matter, energy, information involves tapping, and the tapping involves a shift in responsibility from one system to another, and we also said that tapping can be mediated. Then we looked at organizing principles of entity systems. The first is that entity systems have a threefold organization. In other words, they consist of outward, inward, and self-directed activity systems, whereby the directedness is determined by the purpose of the activity system. Then we said every entity system is the center of the biomatrix. What that means is that every entity system, via its activity systems, connects with other entity systems, and via their activity systems connect to yet other entity systems, and so on. So anywhere in the web, any entity system can be regarded as the center of the web. And the relevance of this is managing outward. It is the stance of leadership, and it is one of the core principles of systemic management, to manage one stakeholder and together with the stakeholder, more stakeholders. Then we said entity systems are organized as a containing systems hierarchy. So entity systems contain sub entity systems. Each sub-entity system contains sub-entity systems, and so on. Each of those entity systems marks a level in the systems hierarchy. We also said that nature's systems show fixed levels, while social systems can have more or less levels depending how we choose to organize ourselves. Then we talked about an entity system being an emergent middle through the co-production of systems from the outer level in the systems hierarchy and from the co-production of systems in the inner environment. And we gave an example like the development of a child being co-produced by cofactors from outside, from inside, and the child itself, the system itself. Then we looked at boundaries between entity systems, and we said that there are clear boundaries between systems from a web perspective, and the boundaries are where systems tap each other. And we said that boundaries from a field perspective, ethos perspective, are fuzzy, they are overlapping, they are not clear. So your and my values would overlap, and clear boundaries are not always establishable.